Hey everybody, this is Dan, and this is week 8 of History 3380. And this week we're going to do a reading by Morris, and it's called Tycoons. And there's 3 chapters scanned in on our website, but you really only need to read chapters 1 and 3. You can skip 2 if you want to. If you want to read 2, it's interesting, but it's sort of going backwards, and we've already covered some of this stuff. So if you want to skip chapter 2, that's perfectly okay. The module objectives for this week, first of all, one of them is to be able to identify the decades where the major industrial growth in the U.S. took place. So the answer to that one, and you'll see it from your reading, is the decades between the 1860s and let's say 1890, 1900 is when industrial capitalism in the U.S. really began to take off. And we're going to read about some of the key individuals for that period of time. And that period of time is called by historians the Gilded Age. And that's a label that historians came up with that runs during that time frame of after the Civil War, 1865, through around 1890, 1900. There's some debate as far as when the Gilded Age ended, but it's really not important for what we're doing right now. Just keep in mind that most of the industrial expansion took place in the decades after the Civil War, 1860, 1870, 1880, 1890. The other module objectives for this week, one of them is to be able to identify individuals and their industries from the Gilded Age. You're going to read about Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Jay Gould. And Carnegie, of course, is the steel magnate, the one who founded Carnegie Steel that eventually became U.S. Steel after it was bought by Morgan in 1911. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil and cornered the market for oil refining. The other one you're going to read about is Jay Gould. He was big into the railroads, and you're going to read a little bit about J.P. Morgan. He was a banker and really someone who cornered the market as far as financing goes and money. And you still hear the Morgan name around today. So those are really 4 of the people. So if you want to identify individuals and their industries, there you have it. And that's really part of this course objective too, that when we get out of this class, we should be able to say, hey, some of the big movers and shakers in American business, the famous guys, would be Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan for sure would be on that list. The other module objective is to be able to categorize the business sectors that grew after the Civil War. This is a real easy one. It's really just like the last objective when we talked about the individuals. Certainly the steel industry, that idea of the build out of America, if you will, steel was really important. So steel is a sector that grows. Refining and petroleum and oil grows after the Civil War. Now keep in mind, we wouldn't have the automobile until the early 1900s. So when you're reading about Rockefeller and him cornering the market on oil, it wasn't because of gasoline. Gasoline was a byproduct that they basically burnt off or threw away back then. It was really kerosene that was the big thing, because kerosene replaced whale oil and candles in many places, and it was used mainly for illumination in lanterns. And this is long before the electric light. So kerosene was a revolutionary new product, and Standard Oil, that was their main thing, was making kerosene, but also oils and lubricants that the machines of the Gilded era, the Gilded Age needed, were also part of that. So really, as far as business sectors are concerned, petroleum, steel, construction for sure, and the railroad. So when you read about Gould, certainly the business sectors that grew after the Civil War, transportation and the railroad has to be included there. So that's the answer to that module objective. And then finally, there's this idea that you need to be able to apply Dan's theory of innovation to other eras. Now, we read about some theories of innovation prior to this time with this idea that when labor's short, there's more innovation to mechanize so production can remain the same. And we read about that 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. But my theory of innovation that I want you to read about and understand is that people, and it's really obvious, people like Rockefeller and people like Carnegie, even though they were brilliant guys and had come up with new processes for manufacturing of steel and refining of oil, and also they really cornered the market in the sense that they had monopolies in both of these industries. None of those things would have mattered if it wasn't for the need for their goods. So that's the simple theory that no matter, how efficient manufacturing is, no matter how much you corner the market, everything has to be timed correctly. And the country was primed for growth. In other words, all of the cities in the United States between the end of the Civil War and the early 1900s, all of the big cities grew like crazy. A lot of the infrastructure that is still in place today in cities like here in Toledo or in Cleveland, that infrastructure, whether it's bridges, whether it's the underground sewer system, some of the buildings, they were all built during that time. So basically the country was being built. And when you're someone who's making steel or have cornered the market in steel, then you have a pretty good market. So my theory of innovation is that all of these things can be in place. You can be brilliant, you can have the right processes, you can have enough money to corner the market, but you also need to have a market that's rapidly expanding. And that was the case in the Gilded Age, especially for Carnegie. The other thing I want you to understand with Carnegie and Rockefeller is, they had monopolies both in steel and in petroleum. And the reason the monopolies, could thrive is because there was absolutely no government regulation whatsoever in the early days of Carnegie or Rockefeller. So, I know we've been debating for the past couple of weeks about, too much government interference and too much government regulation and too much government in business. So if you want to be in a time when there was no government regulation, you'll enjoy the reading for this week, because Carnegie and Rockefeller were both able to shut out all of their competitors through monopolistic practices by, in Carnegie's case, owning the mines, owning the ships that shipped iron ore, all the way up through the steelmaking process. And when he did that, he was able to shut out all the competition. And he had this monopoly in place, and Rockefeller did the same thing with oil refining. So people don't like government interference, but at the same time, if one person controls the entire market and shuts everybody else out from coming in, then that person can control prices. Competition is thought by many economists to keep prices reasonable and to be a more fair playing ground for for ultimately the consumer, because there's competition. But this isn't an econ class. It's not a political science class. It's a history class, and I merely want you to know about these periods of time when all this took place and who the big players were. So that's it for this week. I will see you next week for Module 9. Study hard. Have a great week, and I'll see you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.